an echo in here?
Yes,
What?
I'm Echo.
Hello everybody and welcome back to the Galactic Armory. Today I am very excited to show you guys something I've been working on for a long time. This helmet took me a while to finish just because I had to try so many different methods to try and get it as accurate as possible. But I'm very happy with the end result. I think I got pretty close to how it looks in the show. And today I'm going to show you guys exactly how I did it so that you too can make your own Echo helmet. Now this helmet came a long way, so let's start at the very beginning. Now this helmet, like all my other helmets, was 3D printed. It was printed on a CR10S and it was printed in PLA. The files for this print are my own. You can find links to them in the description. But I also sell the raw 3D prints that we're going to be starting with. So if you don't have a 3D printer or don't have access to one, you can get one there as well. So if you ever wanted to make an Echo helmet, you literally have no excuse. 3D printing has completely made all of this prop making and helmet making accessible to nearly anyone. So if you've been hesitant to try it out, either get yourself a 3D printer or order yourself some raw prints if you want to just try it out first. But if you're watching this video, I have a pretty fair suspicion that you'd be hooked by it. Now, 3D printing helmets is not quick. This helmet took around like 100 or so hours to fully print in one piece. But this will be the easy part because once we finish with this print, there's still a lot of work to do to it to make it ready for painting. So let's dive into that. Now to smooth out the 3D printer lines, the first thing I like to do now is use an ABS-like photopolymer resin from like SLA resin 3D printing. Basically what it is it's just a liquid that will harden when exposed to UV light. What this is gonna do for us is we're gonna paint it over the helmet, trying to fill in those 3D printer lines, and then we'll use a UV flashlight to harden that resin. And that should allow us to sand the helmet, and that would make it a lot smoother. And you're gonna need a smooth surface for painting. Otherwise, people are gonna be able to see the 3D printer lines, and it just doesn't really look good. So that's why we've got to do this. The color of the resin doesn't matter. I just used this clear blue because I wasn't gonna use it for any resin printing, so I just wanted to use it for finishing helmets. It also shows up really well under the UV flashlight, so I can tell which areas of the helmet I've brushed the resin on and which areas I haven't. So if you also use a color that contrasts your filament color, that's another good way to tell. But we're going to be brushing this on the entire helmet. Be sure to wear gloves. You don't want to touch this resin with your bare skin. But after we've brushed on an area, we use the UV flashlight to harden the area. Just go over it for a few seconds, probably around 30, to give the resin a nice start of hardening. Now the resin isn't going to totally harden. We'll take care of that later. You want to be careful to watch out for pooling because since this is a liquid, it will want to pool in the corners, and you don't want to harden that because it's going to be really hard to sand that down if you miss it and accidentally harden it. So just use a very cheap paintbrush to clear out those pooling areas before you use the flashlight. Now this flashlight has to be a UV, an ultraviolet flashlight. You can't just use any ordinary household flashlight, but it's those ultraviolet rays that hardens the resin. Luckily for us, nature provides a free ultraviolet solution in the form of sunshine. So earlier when I mentioned that we'll take care of the kind of tacky resin that's still left over after the hardening, that's how we're gonna do it. We're gonna sit this helmet in the sunshine, like near a window or something, and let it sit there for a day or two. The sun shining on it will gradually harden the rest of the resin that's on there, so it won't be sticky or tacky to the touch. Depending on your area and the UV rating, this could take 1 day or it could take around 3. But we're gonna need that resin on top to be hard enough to sand. So however you wanna get there, that's where we need to be for the next step. Now sanding this resin isn't exactly easy. It's not something I would want to do 100% by hand. So what I like to do is take a mouse sander with some medium grit, I'd say around 120, and go over the entire helmet, just sanding down the high areas, the really easy stuff that's easy to sand and easy to reach with this mouse sander. It's gonna save you a ton of time and a ton of shoulder pain. You don't wanna sand too far down to where you start sanding the plastic because the plastic isn't really gonna like that. It's gonna heat up too hot and start to warp. We're just gonna be sanding the resin. So make sure that you're wearing a respirator because this is gonna make a lot of dust, but also make sure not to sand too hard in one specific area. After I've done a first pass with a mouse sander, I like to use this Rust-Oleum filler and sandable to do a once over on the helmet. This stuff is great for filling in small imperfections and little scratches on the helmet, but it's also great to identify parts of your helmet that still need more sanding and more attention. It's really going to highlight the areas that still need a little bit more work. So the reason for doing this is kind of twofold. One, it helps fill in the lines and the imperfections, and two, it helps identify those imperfections that need a little bit more work. At this point, I'll only do about 1 coat, but we'll be using more in the future. So now it's time to do a bit of hand sanding. And for the first go around, I like to use 180 grit sandpaper, either a sheet of it or a sanding sponge. This is just kind of going over the areas that the filler primer helped identify and just doing a general sanding of the areas that the mouse sander couldn't reach. Again, you're going to want to wear a respirator for this so you don't breathe in all that nasty resin dust, and either do this outside or in a garage or someplace that you don't mind getting a little dirty. At this point, the helmet doesn't need to be perfect. We're going to use one more product to help ensure a smooth surface before we start painting. Now the helmet is looking a lot better, but there are still some very visible layer lines that we want to fill in. And for that, we're going to be using a Bondo glazing and spot putty. This stuff is every prop maker's best friend. I like to use the pre-mixed formula in this little tube, but it also comes in larger quantities that aren't pre-mixed. I find this stuff in the automotive section. It's used to fill in like scratches in cars, but we're going to be using it to finish this helmet. You're going to want to wear gloves for this and a respirator again, but what I like to do is use my gloved finger to rub the Bondo into those areas that still need some more filling. I'm going to go over the entire helmet with this stuff, just covering in any small imperfection that I see. This Bondo starts as a cream, but after like 4 or 5 hours, it'll start to harden on its own. Just be sure and leave this in a well-ventilated area because it does smell pretty bad. That's the reason for the respirator, and you don't want this stuff to touch your skin, and that's the reason for the gloves. Once this Bondo is hardened, we'll be able to sand it just like the resin before, but this stuff is a bit softer and easier to sand, so we're just going to be doing it by hand. Now that we're comfortable with the smoothness of the helmet, we're ready to start painting. And the first thing I want to do is cover it in this stuff called Plasti-Dip. Basically, this Plasti-Dip is a spray-on rubber. And what it's going to do is it's going to give the helmet a nice texture and a nice rubber coating that, I don't know. I just like how it feels. I like how it looks underneath the paint. And this stuff levels itself very well. So it's going to give the paint a nice base coat to lay on top of. Generally, I'll only do 1 to 2 coats of this stuff, waiting an hour between coats. But that's where we're going to be starting. Now I'm going to save you guys a bunch of time and a bunch of the trial and error that I went through trying to match the colors to the helmet in the show. I got to this point of the helmet and I'm like, I hate it. But this is the color of the paint that I ended up going with, and I absolutely love how it came out. So I'm going to be using a Rust-Oleum matte metallic gunmetal gray for the base coat of paint. So now came the hard part. I had to try and emulate the rough wear and tear on the animated helmet and find a way to do it in real life. Because on the animated helmet there are like white, rough lines all over the helmet, but they are very thin and very like difficult to see unless you look very closely. But they're an important part of how the animated helmet looks. So what I started to do was use some paper towels, and I would spray paint the paper towel a little bit, wait a few seconds for most of the paint to dry, because if I rubbed it on immediately it would just leave a big old paint smear. But if you let the paint dry a little bit, less of the paint will come off the paper towel, and it should help match the animated look of the helmet. Now I kind of alternated between the white and the gunmetal silver from before, kind of just layering over each other. This kind of helped give the gunmetal silver a nice white mixture, made it a lot less uniform and a lot closer to what the actual animated helmet looks like in the show. I just kept alternating until I was happy with how the helmet looked between the white and the gunmetal silver, just using paper towels and waiting a few seconds, then gently brushing it on, covering the layers over one another. Eventually I was happy with how the silver looked, and I was ready to add some other colors. Now for the cheeks, I was actually able to reuse the Rust-Oleum filler and sandable from before because it leaves a nice light gray color, and I thought it would work well for the cheeks, the vents, the little vent on the top of the helmet. So I taped off all those areas and gave it a light coat of the filler primer. For the black coloring along the back of the headband and the top of the head, I just used a simple black acrylic paint and painted it with a paintbrush. The spray paints that I was using were a bit too glossy for my liking, and this black acrylic paint gave it a nice matte finish that I really liked. Now it was time to do the white weathering on the black pieces that I just painted, as well as touch up the areas around the rest of the helmet. Now this, I needed to be precise on where the paint is, so I switched from using the paper towel method to dry brushing with a small paintbrush. The trick to dry brushing is being very patient and making sure you have very, very little paint on your paintbrush. You also want to be very light with how much pressure you apply on the paintbrush. The less pressure you apply, the better the dry brushing is going to go. I applied just a little bit of white to most of the hard edges of the helmet, around the top and around the headband that goes around the backside. You want to touch up the edges with this white because that's where the coloring would naturally start to fade away from like naturally hitting things and just kind of rubbing off. It's those hard corners where that paint would start to fade. So that's where we want to apply our white paint. The top headband had quite a few like white marks through it, and so what I did was very gently brush over the entire thing in very long, broad strokes. Be careful not to overdo it here, but also be sure and cover the entire thing. bring up some reference images of the helmet to help you through this part. Now it's time to add a little bit of color and weathering to the cheeks and the vents on the side. They're looking a little bit too clean right now, so we're going to be using a black wash to help dirty up those areas. All you need is a cup, a little bit of water, and the black acrylic paint from before. We're going to mix the paint into the water. This is going to help dilute it a little bit and make it less dark. The basic technique here is to brush on the black wash paint onto the areas that you want to weather, and then quickly wipe it off with a paper towel. Now some of that black paint is going to be left behind, but it's going to be all smudged and smeared and look very organic. It is also going to be left in the recessed areas. See, like those notches on the vent on the top of the helmet? The black paint is going to fill in those notches, and it's going to be a lot harder to wipe that away with paper towel. And that's good, because those recessed areas are areas that would naturally accumulate more dirt and grime than the others. Just be careful not to let your water paint mixture run. I accidentally had that happen and had to clean off the paint that was from the run because it just doesn't look natural. So take it slow and do one area at a time. Now it's time to paint the Arabesh 99 on the front of the forehead, and for that I just use a basic titanium white acrylic paint. But first I trace out the center line and the shapes of the symbols so that I could make sure that they're at least a little bit symmetrical. The center line was easy enough to erase after I was done, and the paint covered all the rest. Now it's finally time to add the mouth details that I've been hiding forever. For that, I'm just going to use a bit of E6000 and some masking tape to help keep them in place while the glue cures. Now these extras, they're painted with the same gunmetal gray as the base of the helmet, and I followed it up with the white dry brushing around the corners, basically like the rest of the helmet. Now you want to make sure that these pieces are taped in because this glue takes 24 hours to fully cure, and I've had it before where the parts move while the glue cures, and then it's basically stuck in the wrong place, and you don't want that. So we'll come back in 24 hours, and we should be able to remove the tape. Now one of the last things we need to do is add a visor so nobody can see directly in our face, and for that I'm going to be using a Hobart face shield. Now these face shields can be hard to find sometimes, but I do have a stock available on my own website. Link will be in the description. Luckily for us, Echo doesn't have a very large visor, so we could probably get 2 or 3 visors out of a single face shield if we're doing Echoes. But I'm just going to cut out what I need, cutting it down to size to try and make it just a little bit bigger than I need to. That'll help when trying to curve the face shield into place and help it fit closer up against the opening. I'm going to be using a steel stick epoxy putty to hold the visor in place. Basically, it's a 2-part putty that once you mix them together, after like a minute, they'll really start to harden and get hot until eventually they're like basically rock hard. But they're going to do a great job at holding the visor in place. They bind very well with the 3D printed walls on the interior, but we're just going to follow it up with some E6000 around the edges of the putty, just as an extra precaution. You want to work fast too because this putty hardens really quickly, but once it is hardened, it should hold that visor in place very well. The last thing we need to do before this helmet is finished is add the little lighting effects, and for that I got some reflective yellow and red sheets. These were easy enough to cut out and just glue into place, and since they're really reflective, they give the impression that it's lights coming through. So we'll do 2 yellow rectangles on the 2 ears, some thin red strips right above those, and then the 4 rectangles on the back side of the helmet in that yellow as well. And some cyanoacrylic super glue will hold those things in place very well. They might not be real light effects, but I feel like they come pretty close. They stand out against the rest of the helmet very, very brightly. So there you go guys, that is how I made my own Bad Batch Echo helmet from scratch. Overall, I'm pretty proud with how the helmet came out. It took a lot of trial and error to get that animated weathering look just right, and I feel like I did a pretty good job of it. Links to the 3D files, the 3D prints, all the materials that I used will be in the description, so be sure and check that out if you need to. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next one.